Wonderful. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining for one of our last sessions of the day. I am delighted to be speaking with Andrew Winston, who is, uh, I would say, one of the biggest thought leaders in this space, but also a voice that has been galvanizing business for decades to really think about the transition to green, and now really looking at the next phase of that work of what does net positive look like. And so his most recent book, Net Positive, was co-authored with Paul Pullman, the former CEO of Unilever. And we'll really be doing a deep dive on the key messages of the book, but also how we can apply it in this very fragile geopolitical context. And so with that, Andrew, why don't we kick off? Why don't you tell us a little bit about what is net positive and how would you define net positive companies?
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm glad to be a part of the day. I saw some of the other folks that were speaking. It looks like it's been a lot of fun. So net positive is kind of born from the idea that we're really not going fast enough, the speed and scale of what we need to do. As countries, as citizens, and as companies, we're not going fast enough to tackle climate change, inequality, biodiversity loss. And we need companies to kind of ramp up the level of ambition. So, by and large, companies have been working incrementally, right? Getting better where they can, cutting emissions here and there. And we need to set the goal that's, even beyond zero. So we define net positive as a company that profits and grows. And this is the way that they make money and create value by solving the world's problems, not contributing to them. And we ask this kind of basic question, which is the world better off because your company is in it? Which is hard to answer, honestly. And I find people it kind of stops them for a minute. And, more specifically, we mean that the business creates well-being for everybody that they impact. So all their stakeholders, your employees, consumers and customers, communities, suppliers, and you're doing this through all your work, all your actions, products and services, every factory, every country you operate in. And this is a North Star, clearly. I mean, we're not claiming Unilever's there. But there's pieces of it, right? There's companies doing some of it. I know you had TerraCycle on. They're clearly one of the solutions, right? They're one of the stories that shows we can probably do this, that you can actually upcycle. You can find another good use for things. So it's a new level of ambition for companies that leads to much more systems change, much bigger thinking, and the kinds of partnerships we need to solve the really big problems.
And how is this different from corporate social responsibility or, some of the previous thinking in this space?
Well, I mean, I think it's kind of been an evolution. I mean, corporate social responsibility, I guess it gets kind of a bad rap as a word because I think we all in this space kind of equate it with more like philanthropy. I think it really started early on as, not exactly compliance. That was kind of already a term, very legal focused, but just knowing you're supposed to do some good things, like on Earth Day, you should plant some trees and you should, do some philanthropy with your employees, and was never really discussed and thought about as a business strategy, right? As core to the business. And so I think there's been this general evolution. And, my first book was Green to Gold almost 16 years ago. And that was kind of the next step from CSR, which said, hey, this is good for your business to put a environmental or sustainability lens on your thinking and, cut costs and, drive revenues through innovation, through green innovation. And, I think that was what a lot of companies needed to hear. Still, many need to hear it, that this isn't some anti-business plot, that this isn't somehow diminishing the performance of business, but it's actually improving it. And we're still fighting that battle, I think. I mean, every day, I literally, every conversation I have pretty much has some version of the question, well, doesn't this always cost more? And we can dig into that. It's kind of my least favorite question in the world at this point, but but it comes up all the time. So I think, we're trying to push kind of beyond that and say, improving the world, it should just be part of how you do business. Because if you don't have a purpose, what are you doing? Like, what is the purpose, right? Why do you exist?
So let's pivot to purpose and principles. How are net positive companies really embedding this into their practices?
Purpose is an interesting one, right? It's become this really hot word. And I think it's not always easy to do. I think for some companies, there's kind of a clear answer. There's a little bit of soul searching. I think, what Paul did at Unilever had a long history of already did plenty before Paul was there. But it hadn't been kind of a coordinated driving force in the business. And he actually went back to the beginning, quite literally went to the archives and visited the town where Unilever built its first facility and housed their first batches of employees. I mean, there was like a little community that they built. It already was a very different kind of business, and kind of looked at why they started. And they had an initial statement in the 1870s that was about making cleanliness commonplace. And it also said reducing the workload for women, which just told you something about, who did everything. I guess hasn't changed that much, but, and then, he kind of took that history and said, okay, we can expand this. And the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan is making sustainable living commonplace. So he just kind of expanded it. I think not every company has that clear a history, but most companies do. There's a reason companies were formed. Maybe it was just someone wanted to do anything to make money, but usually they had some passion or purpose behind it, right? And going back and finding that, I think is really important. And then, also thinking about your own purpose. It's really critical that people bring themselves to work and connect what they think they're really doing in the world with the company's purpose and goals as well. So it's kind of it's a very personal process that you have to start with, even as you're trying to build the company's purpose.
So is it more top down, bottom up? How would you define that whole journey?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's nice to say that you'd like it kind of to be all levels and that, there's plenty that needs to be bottom up. My gut is this kind of thing has to kind of start with a small group at the top to kind of make sure they're kind of in sync, and then kind of reaching out to various stakeholders. I think as you're developing your thoughts about, is this the right way to think about what we do? And then you can talk to everybody, right? You can get the new employee perspective, and you should. But I do think it's probably a small crew at first to say, let's start working on what our purpose is. Where did we come from? What was our history? What do we uniquely do? What can we do for the world that maybe nobody else can do, or we can do very well? And how does it connect to the world's biggest challenges? So what's different fundamentally about sustainability, all the work that we do, and about net positive is that it's fundamentally outside in, right? There's been, for the most part, companies operate on core competencies, reducing costs, competing on cost, or competing on differentiation. Going back to Michael Porter kind of classic strategy, but it's based on kind of what you can do. But there's kind of a combination now where you have to be thinking about the world's thresholds. That wasn't a consideration when the world kind of seemed infinite, maybe 50 years ago, when this whole modern shareholder primacy took over. It really wasn't a concern that you'd kind of run out of space, or run out of stable climate to dump carbon into. And so now there's these constraints, right? And I think for those who are familiar with the donut economics idea from Kate Raworth and others, that there's just physical thresholds, right, that we have to kind of stay within, or we're just going to sign ourselves up for a much poorer world. And then there's kind of a minimal moral threshold, or minimal personal, social threshold of everybody should have sufficiency. Everybody should have kind of a fair shot, right, and have enough to start with. And if we can operate society within those boundaries, I think we'll have a much higher level of well-being than we have today.
I think that's a great point. And so I want to move to the personal leadership side of it, right? So how do you think about this from a moral standpoint?
Yeah.
And how do you think about it simultaneously from a business standpoint? Now, obviously, Paul was very successful at Unilever, but you look at Danone and that didn't go as well. So maybe we could talk a little bit about, how do you marry that personal journey and commitment with the business?
Well, look, I think Paul always said, and it was interesting in writing this with him, and it was probably one of the only things where he was a little bit further on one kind of spectrum than I am towards like typical business growth, typical business value. I mean, for all that he talks about, and he speaks in a way that we have not heard CEOs speak. And I think I really do believe he should kind of go down in history as one of the most important CEOs, because he just has changed the language. But he still says, but we had to grow. We had to have, the stock had to do okay, and we had to have profits. You have to hit your numbers. So he says all the time, you still have to be operating well, right? And using sustainability as the way you do that in part. But there's still going to be some hard choices. There's still, he had to close factories every now and then, and that people have criticized, that's not good on the S side of sustainability, but the business still has to operate as a business. I think, in that kind of instance, it's about, is it a just transition for if you have to close a business? How are you treating people, right? It's about how you operate. Are you humane? Not that you're going to stop being a business, which has ups and downs, and works within, the capitalist system we have, while working to change it, right? It's like it's similar to, we all fly around in the climate and sustainability space while we're working to change the system so flying is smaller footprint, or we don't need to fly as much, or you have to use the system you're in. I've probably gone off on a tangent. I think I went off from what we were talking about, but we can kind of dig in again if you want to ask it again if I missed the core.
Yeah, well, I guess one of the reasons that maybe Danone was less successful is, we think about the investors and the board and bringing people along on that journey. So
Right.
maybe we talk a little bit about those stakeholders
Yeah.
and how they operate in a net positive world.
That's right. I forgot to, I don't know if I have anything all that smart to say about Danone. I think it's, there's a lot of reasons, a board says they don't think their CEO's doing a good job. They might be wrong. They might be right. But I guess I always hope that we get to a point where when someone is ousted, right, and they say we need a new kind of leader, we need a different CEO, it isn't assumed it's because of the sustainability efforts. Like, why is that the assumption, right? Like, it could be they didn't execute on sustainability well enough, right? Because people always ask me versions of, well, does sustainability pay, and is it good for business? I'm like, well, good sustainability is. It's like asking, is marketing good for your business? Well, good marketing is, right, but bad isn't. So I think we have to, bring sustainability into just a way you do business, and not have it constantly be in this other category that somehow isn't about business, doesn't in a way have the burden of performing well. I mean, what I think Unilever did, and the companies that lead do well, is they do expect performance, but they extend the time horizon, right? They know that some things take investment. They don't expect everything to pay off immediately because it's called sustainability. And they reap kind of a growing, growing like dividend every year of building long-term value, building your stakeholder relationships, and it kind of builds over time. So I don't think we all know really why Emmanuel Faber, was pushed out. It happened to David Crane at NRG years ago. He was pushing the coal-based company that they had to get to renewables. He was right, but maybe he was too early for them. Look, boards, I just actually got off a call an hour ago talking to the NACD, the Association of Corporate Directors, and boards are in a really interesting place. And the studies show very clearly they don't have a lot of knowledge on sustainability. That's just kind of factual. There's an NYU study last year, showed they looked at the 1,100 or so directors in the Fortune 100, and I think 5 of them had any real climate background, either science or policy or whatever. Basically nobody. And they're getting asked more and more questions about this ESG thing. They don't really fully get it. They're not fully representative, right? There's a huge movement to get more diversity of not just race and gender, but thought. They're old. This is just factual stuff, right? They're not representative. And it makes it so that one of the kind of craziest statistics to me in the book was that when CEOs and executives were polled about what was driving their short-term pressure, investors was not the number one, it was number 2. Number 1 was their board. The boards were actually, and that was surprising to me and also kind of depressing, because if there's anybody in the organization that should be thinking long-term value, long-term stability and viability of the business and resilience, it should be the board, right? CEO tenures have dropped 3 to 5 years now. So maybe it's understandable. They're just kind of drive up the stock price, get their options out there, but the board should be thinking longer term. So I think it's hard to say, why some companies have found this sustainability thing. They may not think it's working the way they want it to. Companies have ups and downs. Unilever's been criticized lately for not doing as well as it should. It's still doing very well, but companies, especially ones that last 150 years, they have plenty of ups and downs, and you kind of got to have the resilience and build this base that makes for kind of a net positive, more sustainable company where you've got buy-in, you've got purpose, you've got employees who are all in, so that you can ride out the hard times, and come back stronger. And I think Danone will be fine.
Yeah. Yeah, and definitely interesting. And your point about research on boards, actually, yesterday we had a whole day focused on research. And one of the emerging studies was on CEO activism and
Mm-hmm.
how boards perceive that. And it was a really interesting, when there is alignment, it's very, very successful for the organization and the CEO. And when there's not, obviously the CEO is, their tenure is,
Yeah.
impacted. So I think
Yeah.
that's a really, it's a really big source of tension. And boards often precede the CEO and succeed them. So how do you think about, yeah, it's really interesting that they're so focused on the short term. So I take that point in a really
Yeah.
interesting way.
Well, they are heavily weighted towards traditional kind of financial people, CFOs, CEOs. It's a circular group, right? It's kind of tiny in reality, right? The
Yeah, they all
CEOs
sit
are
on
on each
multiple
they're on
boards.
each other's
Exactly.
boards, so they're setting each other's compensation. I mean, it's not it's not conducive to a kind of more diverse, thoughtful approach for the long haul. And I think the age does matter. I'm not being ageist. I think there's wisdom and value. I'm not saying someone 80 can't serve on a board, but if you don't have a mix of perspectives, I don't think it's insulting to say that climate change just probably doesn't matter as much to an 80-year-old. I mean, it isn't going to be in their lifetime as scary as it is for a 20-year-old, right? I mean, they're facing, for a 20-year-old, they're looking at, when we talk about long scenarios of 2100, 20-year-olds are probably expected, a lot of them, to make it to 2100, and kids born today are going to make it to 2100. So this is in their lifetime that we're talking about. It's just a different horizon.
And so thinking about that horizon and thinking about net positive companies, how do you see that intersection? Let's talk about resilience and how do you build for the long term? How do you manage those ups and downs?
Yeah, I think, kind of the order of battle that we have in the book for building a net positive company, which I think we believe builds a lot of resilience, is starting with that inside, right? Starting with yourself. How much do you care as a leader, as an executive? And kind of building that purpose, connecting it, setting these really big goals, so that you're on the right path towards the kinds of goals that we need to set to solve our big problems, so that you're, setting net zero goals and science-based targets and all of that. Building this kind of trust and transparency is this really critical glue. And that happens through transparency, through a lot of openness, I think through humility. And so you're starting to build, as you do this more and more, you're building the capacity to do more effective and larger partnerships. And that alone, if you can get to some effective partnerships, does provide some resilience. It's kind of the classic, lashing the boats together. It's not going to save coal from going out of business. That's an economic and environmental imperative. So coal companies are not going to probably be able to have a partnership that's going to change that. But there's so many problems that can be solved in these partnerships. And I think that gives you, we talk about it gives kind of a collective courage. Courage is so critical. And it's easier if you have your peers around you. And we talk about de-risking the political process, meaning you go into the government, you're having a big enough conversation that it's less risky now for another CEO and another politician to jump in. They have cover, right? The more people are doing it together. So it's that kind of group action that I think really builds resilience, because you're part of a larger system. And you are, in theory, if you're kind of addressing the right systematic problems or right kind of sector level problems, you're making the business, more resilient over time by solving the really big challenges, and that, I think, allows you then to ask a bunch of other really tough questions about your business and really address what we call the elephants in the room in the book. And we can dig into some of them, but things like, do you pay taxes, and corruption and human rights, and all of those things are kind of a drag on the business, the respect for it, its brand. And I think as you start to address more and more of these issues, you just have more and more support from stakeholders. And we open the book with the story of Unilever almost being taken over in year 7 of Paul's tenure by a 3G, PE firm, private equity, and Kraft Heinz that they owned. And that firm was known, the private equity, for just cutting costs. And it was a totally opposite mindset from Unilever. And what partly fought it off was the stakeholder support. That was kind of unusual, that Unilever had built enough of a relationship that there were union heads and Greenpeace calling and saying, what can we do? How can we help you? And I talked to one of the union heads. He said, we were just worried their business model was going to get crushed and go in the wrong direction. And you had that kind of support, even from some investors who said, no, we want the long term. We don't want to just get short-term value. And that builds resilience, right? The more diverse your system is, the support you have from stakeholders, you have your employees all bought in, then you have resilience.
I think that's a great example of how you really create that system and that ecosystem of support, during tough times. And it really does pay off when you're building those relationships for long-term success.
Yeah.
Let's go back to partnerships. I'm really curious for the audience to hear some examples of that cross-industry collaboration and ways that, we can think about collaboration as opposed to competition in this space.
So the whole book in a way the whole theory builds to the partnerships. That's really the crux of it. And there was so much to say that we kind of ended up with 2 chapters, and there's kind of a subtle, nuanced kind of difference between the two. There's overlap like in real life, but we have a category that we call 1 + 1 = 11, where just by working together, you're getting these kind of outsized gains because you're changing, maybe the economics for a material, you're helping to build together a recycling infrastructure, things like that. And those are often really your kind of value chain and with peers, depending on the topic. And there's lots of really great examples. I mean, there's so much going on now. I mean, it started with, I think on the climate front, a lot of, just signed statements like we're still in, and sector-based statements that at least brought companies together. But you're now having more and more, partnerships really trying to solve problems like, World Economic Forum has kind of gathered a bunch of the sectors that are the most energy intensive that are still really the remaining really big problems. Like we could put enough solar on buildings and put heat pumps. Like there's a bunch of things we can do, but making steel, making aluminum, making cement are just incredibly energy intensive. And so those sectors are coming together as peers to try to work on these problems and come up with ways that they can all use. And it's unusual, right? That's pretty competitive, but they're saying we got to solve this problem together. My kind of favorite example in the book, and one of my favorite stories of kind of working with your value chain in an interesting way, is Apple. And they helped fund and found a joint venture with Rio Tinto and Alcoa about 5 years ago that to make a new form of aluminum that uses a process that greatly reduces carbon. And they had they're kind of in test, they're not at scale yet, but they had enough to use in kind of one category of product. And they did that a few years ago. And they just announced in the last week that the latest batch kind of hit 0 carbon. And I don't frankly even know the full technology. And what I love about this is they're working with their suppliers. They're trying to solve this problem about their devices. Like they're already powering all their data centers and everything with renewables. So to make their whole business carbon free, they have to get their devices down. But what's interesting is they went after aluminum, and as big as Apple is, they're tiny in aluminum. Aluminum is in planes and cars and buildings. So, in cans and everything. So they're not going to move the whole needle, except they bought the kind of first batch of this new aluminum. The second batch was bought by Audi for one of their electric cars for the wheels. And then there was another just bought by, I think, InBev, or one of the beverage companies, for cans. So this is to me like classic net positive, because just getting their own carbon footprint to 0 about their devices is a great thing, but it doesn't create a ripple. This does, right? This ripples into other sectors even. And so there's a lot of that, I think, really forward thinking work that still remains to be done, but there's some really great examples. And then the other kind of partnership is the really deep systematic stuff that's much even harder. And that's fundamentally about getting government at the table. So you have government, civil society, and business solving systematic problems together. And we can dive into examples of that. But the main one in the book is about palm oil, and it's kind of a long story, but there's finally been success really in reducing the deforestation in Indonesia. And it's really about the full system, getting all the players at the table. It took years and years. I mean, the big lesson for me in writing this and studying this was, this is not easy, right? If it were, we'd all be out of a job. All the CSOs in the world wouldn't need to work. I mean, ideally, a chief sustainability officer, their goal should be ideally to work themselves out of a job, right? You shouldn't, on some level, theoretically not be needed if you make it just how the business works. I mean, it's oversimplified, but I probably didn't think 20 years ago that I'd still be doing some of the things I'm doing now. But I think, we're moving now to a different scale of conversation, and partnerships is why they're just exploding.
And so let's go into that. We don't have to go into the palm oil example,
Yeah.
but let's talk about the policy environment. And then
Yeah.
obviously we'll transition into the geopolitical context. But I think, how can businesses leverage policy to become more net positive and to create
Yeah.
net positive systems?
Yeah. So another story from the book, it happens to come from Russia of all places, but it really could have been in many countries. I didn't realize this, but Russia has an extended producer responsibility law of some kind, and they charge companies kind of on volume of packaging materials, which is great. But Unilever Russia wanted to launch kind of a new line or extension with all recycled content packaging, and there really wasn't the infrastructure, and so they went and with a couple partners, with some suppliers, basically built some infrastructure to get enough for their launch. And then what got interesting to me, this is the story of, okay, what does it mean to go to government? They worked with an academic and kind of worked up a different way to charge for materials. They went to the government and said, hey, why don't we charge less or zero for the ones that come through a recycled system, that have more post-consumer recycled content. So you differentiate and you drive change through pricing to the whole system. They didn't just go in, and this is the distinction to me. They didn't go in and say, can we get a tax break for the investment that we did and depreciate, and we're great, we've got enough for our line. They went in to say, how do we change the system so us, all of our products, all of our peers can also move to this and drop the price, because you get to scale the more you get people involved. That to me is the kind of, advocacy that's needed. And so much of what companies do, government affairs is fundamentally about stopping all regulation. I mean, oversimplified, but that's kind of the job. And so it's a big switch to say, okay, instead of walking in and saying, how do we roll back taxes? How do we make sure it's free trade? And just having that agenda, you walk in and say, what are the big problems we're facing? How can we help, get a Green New Deal in place? What do we need to do to get more renewables built? And you go in with peers, with civil society, and you're having a much larger conversation. I think that's the only way at this point, but it means a pretty deep change in the relationship in some countries, especially. There's so much, kind of skepticism, right, from each side of the table between NGOs and business and government, on and on. And we have to kind of develop more trust and have a kind of a better conversation.
There's a question from the audience that I think actually touches upon this really nicely. Is how do you explain why questions about the business case for sustainability are so persistent?
Yeah, this is the one that keeps me up at night. I'll try to do this quickly, but it's hard because this is, to me, the core. It's at the core of the problem of why aren't we further along? I mean, things are moving now. I should have said maybe at the beginning of all this, the last 2 years, dramatic change in corporate buy-in. We're at the end of the beginning. Like, all big companies get sustainability on the agenda. They don't think it's all BS. They may not many of them might think it should be core to their strategy and they should be doing that positive. That's still a tiny number, but they're all at the table now. And that's a huge change. And yet, I mean, I'm not kidding when I say, especially since the book came out and I was doing media podcasts or speaking like this daily, kind of doing that daily. And going back 15 plus years now, every conversation that's not with necessarily sustainability people, and we all kind of speak the same language, but any sector, media I'm talking to, some version of well, but how can you do this since it costs more? That question comes up still. And I wrote a piece 4 or 5 years ago saying, I'm really tired of this question. So why is it persistent? I think there's inertia in the system. There can be some truth to the sustainable choice could cost more. Say more on the social side, like going to living wages does raise costs. That's kind of the point, right? So it can look like that's worse, but part of what makes it so persistent is that sustainability, more than a lot of other business investments, creates intangible value, longer term value, deeper connections with customers or communities, more productive employees, like just all these things that are very hard to measure. And we don't measure them. And companies kind of call it zero. And so they think they're looking at a return on investment that says this costs more because maybe it costs a little more upfront. It's like, one of the clearer examples, building a really, really green building. will probably cost more upfront. But what's the total life cycle cost, right? And there's lots of things like that where there's a total life cycle or there's additional value that we don't measure. So that's part of why it's persistent, because the numbers kind of lie. By the way, none of us pay for the externalities. So the sustainable option looks worse than the one that's externalizing all their costs. Not always, right? Like renewables are now cheaper, just flat out cheaper. But the larger answer, and this is a much longer conversation, is that I think the world is about stories. That's kind of my job, is partly telling stories. And there's a very deeply held narrative that is so dominant that people can't even see that they're in it. That goes back to Milton Friedman and shareholder primacy, but it's part of a larger neoliberal model that says your happiness and well-being are just how much you make, how much stuff you can buy. And a country's well-being is really just its GDP or its stock market. Like that's it. And it is so deeply held that if it sounds like you're talking about anything but that, you're going against something that has been drilled into us as the patriotic thing to do, the religious thing to do. I mean, I'm not exaggerating. Like oil companies spent years spending money telling people they were American if they, put their foot on the gas and burned more oil. So it's hard to take a paradigm down because that paradigm is also defended by the most powerful, right? It's part of why the wealth is all flowed up. The inequality's gotten worse. It's very hard, right? And those of us in this field, we've been trying to do it for years and years and years. And that's kind of my deeper purpose, actually, is not just corporate sustainability, but identifying and telling the story that we're in and trying to tell a better one, right? Because this story is killing us. It had some purpose, right? There's some benefits of focusing on growth. And, we got billion people out of poverty in the last, century. Like that's pretty good, but, it's killing us. So it is about story and narrative and challenging, just challenging as I'm trying to, that the purpose of a business is maximizing money this month. Like it's just doesn't have to be. And there's just also total misperceptions. I get asked the question, a more detailed version of that question about, well, companies' fiduciary responsibility is to maximize shareholder profits. It's not true. Fiduciary responsibility is a very broadly defined thing. And it's actually legally really about people who like manage money, right? Like that you are taking responsibility for someone else's money and you will not do it in your own interest. That's kind of all it means. It is never said anywhere, company must maximize profits this quarter. Just means you're supposed to take good care of the resources that you're shepherding for others. And that can mean long-term care, right? I mean, I liken it to raising your kids. I'm a fiduciary responsible for my kid, and that means 20 years of helping them become an adult. It doesn't mean this quarter and squeeze as much out of them, get them to work as much at home as possible, and then kick them out. So I know that was long, but it's a really deep, hard problem.
I think it is a really deep, hard problem. And, certainly, actually, Sally this morning read a really interesting quote about what we don't take into account when we think about the system, right? And when we think about GDP. And just to that point, how do you see it changing? I mean, let's talk about the broader context here, right? We know SEC regulations are evolving. We see the Great Resignation, particularly amongst younger workers. Yeah. And then, of course, there's also what's happening between Russia and Ukraine. So I want to dig into those three next, but I don't know which one you'd like to choose first.
Well, I think the easiest one is probably the Great Resignation. I mean, it's not exactly happening in every country. It does seem to be in America. I think it's just indicative of, I got into this field from being in kind of regular business after the dot-com crash in 2000. Total economic ruin. The dot-com I worked for went under, and I had this kind of freedom to rethink where I wanted to go. That happens every major depression, the 2008 crash, this combination pandemic economic, year and a half of 2020, 2021, when there's this kind of deep challenge or kind of destruction of a system, people step back and go, what do I really care about? What do I really want to do? It's really common. And I think it leads people to try to find more purpose in their life and say, life's short. I think we're all thinking that right now. It's so easy for people to see pictures of refugees and think, oh, it's just poor people and they don't have it. It's like, no, that's you. This is us just being run out of our homes. That's what's happening over there, right? People are just literally picking a bag up and leaving their homes. It's unimaginable, right? There's 4 million of them on the road now. in addition to the numbers that have been killed that are going to just be so much higher than people realize. And, so I think the purpose side, the Great Resignation. So that was one. Ukraine was the other. What was the third one? The SEC or yeah. SEC is great. I think there's debate online in the sustainability community that it doesn't go far enough. It's not clear enough. There's no step towards something, towards deep change that's perfect, right? There's many battles to get to civil rights or suffrage. There wasn't like nobody was talking about it, and then the Supreme Court enabled gay marriage. Like there was 40 years of little legal cases. Like that's where we are, right? Getting it into the system, getting the SEC to say part of materiality is your climate impact is huge. I think it's enormous. It shows that we're at the end of the beginning, that we've institutionalized it. We've got it institutionalized. Then we can start to make the definitions better, make it science-based, drive change, not just reporting, right? Because reporting itself, it helps, it highlights it. So it makes you go look at it, but it's not the same as outcomes, right? And we have a very specific outside in like survival outcome that we need to be shooting for. And then it's funny. So Paul Pullman and I were kind of dancing around writing something about Ukraine. What does this mean for business and net positive? And he's written some stuff already that's been really powerful. It's really hard, right? I think we're in a time where the urgent and important are overlapping. Like this is urgent and it's really important. I think this is one of the most important battles, in human history, because this is a battle over democracy. This is, in essence, Putin's been waging war on us and, kind of freedom for years, right? Through digital, through undermining truth, misinformation. And now it's turned into a hot war with Ukraine as the unfortunate at the point of the spear. So this is big, but I do believe that all of our issues are connected, right? Inequality is partly what drives people to populism and gets them towards supporting, so that Putin has broad support in his country. I think Bolsonaro has it in Brazil. There's an amazing amount of support for Trump here, right? So these are connected issues, and the uncertainty that's coming from climate, right? There's refugees from climate. It's creating these deeper connected problems. And I do think, a net positive approach and attitude is part of the solution. It's not the only one, but taking that view as business and as government that we should be trying to improve the situation with everything and not just reduce the bad is part of how we're going to manage all this. But honestly, we're at a time where it feels like, how could something bigger happen? And then something bigger happens and it keeps happening. And I try to tell my kids, like, we're in a historic time and it's not easy. I think, our well-being is tested. It's really hard living right now, honestly. Not as hard as the Ukrainians, but like, it's hard to watch what's going on if you care. And, these battles are difficult, but they are all connected.
And so from a corporate perspective, what can companies, particularly net positive companies, do to marry that focus on sustainability with inequality, with social justice? How do they think about it holistically? Yeah. What's some step that they can take to get started?
Well, I think there's probably been, a surprising amount of kind of movement on trying to improve racial equity since the George Floyd killing. There's these tipping points. It's hard to say why. Yes, there was a video and we were all at home watching it, but there had been videos before, and there were unarmed Black men killed for years and years. But something happened, something snapped, and it caused companies to look at their diversity efforts in a deeper way, to do things like Sephora, the retailer, and others set a goal that 15% of your product on shelf will be from Black-owned enterprises. It's those kinds of efforts that start to try to equal out the economic field and give more power. I don't know if you've noticed on LinkedIn, if you scroll down, it suggests some people of color that you might want to follow. Like, every company's finding their way to kind of equal out what's been a systematic. It's amazing that this critical race theory debate is just the dumbest thing, because of course there's systemic racism. It's insane to even doubt that. And there's so much more awareness of it now, and companies are trying now to be more representative of the world. Disney's taking heat because of the Don't Say Gay bill. They're trying to react. They're now saying they want more of their characters to be gay, trans, like they're trying to represent the world in a better way. So I think these are the things companies can do, is to say, are we representing in our people, in the products? Are we serving well. I think there's been an under focus that I frankly hadn't thought enough about until, kind of Paul and I worked together about disabilities, the disabled getting brought into companies. So it's partly just setting those goals, right? Setting the kinds of goals, not just zero carbon, but we're going to have half women on the board. We're going to have this percentage of Black and Latino in management, whatever. It is getting those social goals more quantitative. And that's definitely changed, because I've been tracking goals for many years and they didn't used to be quantitative at all. They were all like these nice statements about we like parity. And now there's really like targets in so many companies. And I think that's a big part of it. You put it out there publicly, you make it part of the discussion in a really deep way. And that starts to create movement. But I think that the best things are things like Sephora, what some of the banks are doing, where you start to create economic power and more ongoing kind of wealth and base of power that's more lasting, right? Than making a statement and, kind of offering a product to the Black community, right? It's starting to give them more power. And that's, part of the uncertainty in the world, right? There's a reactionary part of the country that feels like if someone else is doing better, it must mean I'm doing worse. And we've done a poor job in this narrative, because that narrative, that first neoliberal narrative is win, lose, right? It's zero-sum game. And the sustainability community, I think we have to find a better way to tell the narrative that we're all going to be better off if we're all better off, right? There's plenty of pie if we do this right. You don't have to lose out because someone else has a better life. So these are, obviously enormous questions, and I'm not qualified to answer them, but turns out nobody is, right? Like nobody knows how to answer these things. And for some reason, people expect the president or whatever leader to be able to answer everything. Like Joe Biden's supposed to handle inflation, global inflation. It's just, I don't care who's in power. It's not like partisan. I would say this if it was Trump. He can't control inflation. He can't control the price of gas. It's ludicrous. When they say the president should dig more gas, we're not nationally owned. We're not Venezuela. Like the president can't say, go get more oil. Like that's just not a thing. So we live in strange times, where people expect weird things that can't be done. And there's a lot of be the change in the world we have to do it, right? We can't wait for someone to save us. We have to do it bottom up.
Yeah. And I think there's an interesting underlying thread here around technology and the positive ways and the negative ways that we can leverage technology. And I know there are a few examples that you mentioned in the book, but also, in the conversations we've had in the past. How can we think about these kind of dovetailing the fourth industrial revolution with a net positive revolution? And, how do we marry the two?
Have we ever had anything quite as double-sided sword as like data, information, technology? It is. Someone asked me in an event yesterday, like, what surprised you? Which was a kind of question I haven't really gotten. And I said things like the speed that companies responded on Russia was, I think, kind of shocking. The speed a bunch of companies responded on pulling money out after January 6th from politicians, surprising to me. But I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought so late in the day. What was the question?
Technology
again?
And
oh, right, yeah. So, but the technology, wow, it's not surprising anymore. But I think it legitimately surprised the techno optimists of the world, the big Silicon Valley guys, and all of us who tend to be techno optimists. What happened when you actually made information available to all? It was supposed to be this great equalizer. Everyone would have the truth, and we created more information bubbles than when there was no internet. Right? Like people are more ensconced now in their bubble, getting just the same story from the same few people they follow through Facebook. And it's probably in reality the biggest problem we face. The misinformation that's dividing us, causing anger, starts to tear down democracy, tears down that common good feeling, and makes it even harder to do the things we need to. So misinformation to me is like the biggest problem. And I think Facebook is the most dangerous company on the planet. Whoever's putting out misinformation or propaganda, Facebook's the one multiplying it. And I don't fully understand why they haven't changed the algorithms. Again, I'm oversimplifying, but you don't have to have algorithms that show you things that will make you enraged, because that's what will make you click more. You don't have to do that. And so we have to really question, I think, these tech companies and their moral place and their position. They're doing a ton on carbon, right? And zero carbon for their data centers and everything, but the impact of how much power they all have, the 5 or 6 companies that own all the technology, all the data and information, and what are they doing, right, to make the world better, right, instead of making more clicks happen. And it's just, given the scale of their wealth, the cash hoard they have, there's a lot that could be done. And I think there's a range in these companies. Some are doing really good things, right? But we have a really strange thing happening where we also need AI and data and technology to make the zero carbon world happen, to radically improve efficiency in logistics and transportation, in buildings, in water systems. We need more data, sensors everywhere, trillions of data points, all of that. Probably need some blockchain for tracking certain things, like Unilever's doing that with palm oil now. So we need it, but if we don't solve the problem of the downsides, the information side of it, we're in trouble. So it's it's hard to say. Is it worth it? I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's as you were saying, such a double-edged sword. How do you take the good and leave the bad? And it's a big challenge. I think it's a really big challenge, and certainly as we face instability from a number of factors, I think it's something that we'll need to address. But the potential is there as well, right? You're talking about this zero carbon future. We need those technological tools in order to get there, and to measure what we're doing, and to really have a sense of how we create these breakthroughs and these leaps. So it's definitely tricky. I'm going to ask you one last question, and then I'm going to ask the audience to put their questions in the chat as well. Okay. Let's talk about the next phase of net positive, and what are the things that you're excited about, and maybe some of the things that keep you up at night about it?
Well, just on kind of the net pot, we're trying to create a movement, right? I mean, selling a book is fun, but we really want the level of ambition to rise. We think the book's helpful. We think it gives a lot of tools to think about building this kind of enterprise. So we're spending a lot of time, continuing to write, connect net positive to what's going on in the world, put out more ideas, more content, but also bring it to the rest of the world. We'll be in like 12 languages by the end of the year, and probably more next year. So expand. I mean, it's selling globally really well, and that's kind of nice to see. We can try to bring this to a lot of different countries. But we're also taking a look at curriculum, business schools, undergrad. How can we help the folks already out there, some of the professors we all know that write great books that have been trying to change how business is taught? How do we accelerate that so that business schools sustainability isn't an elective in the second year, it's just core? We have to change how we're all taught. And that's where you start to break down that narrative, right? Where the business schools have adopted, and the undergrads, the econ departments have kind of all adopted over the years, that purpose of business is simple, it's just money and shareholders. We got to break that down. I think starting where the education happens is part of it. And by the way, the folks that kind of brought you this neoliberal model, they very much planned and spent money on getting into curriculum, getting into business schools, getting into undergrad. It was part of the plan. And we have to do the same with sustainability. So that's part of what we're working on that I'm excited about. Look, there's a lot to be optimistic about. The clean economy stuff is just so fast. It's moving so quickly. The fact that all the auto companies are saying they're basically going to get out of internal combustion engines over the next 10, 15 years is remarkable, faster than I would have thought. I'm seeing just so much weird creativity in trying to change the whole packaging dynamic, like TerraCycle. Someone just showed me today this company, what's it called? It's a soap bottle. I don't know if people have seen this, but it's the bottle itself is soap, and there's shampoo in it. And when it's empty, you can just use the bottle of soap. So there's no packaging. There's just really interesting, cool innovations going on. People are dancing around trying to figure out carbon sequestration. It's really early. We're going to need to do it. There's just cool stuff happening. So it's hard not to be optimistic about that. What keeps me up at night is misinformation and democracy. I think, to be blunt, I think America's in really deep trouble. And there is no one stopping what's happening at the state level with Republican legislatures. To be blunt, it's one, I don't know why when people talk about this, the news, they talk about it, they say there is an attack on democracy, and no one actually points who's doing it. There are Republican-led legislatures that are passing laws to restrict voting and to put people into the Secretary of State position so they can overturn the election if they feel like it. I don't think people quite realize how close we are to not a representative government, and how fast it's moving. So the coup attempt, that wasn't the end. That was the beginning. And so it keeps me up at night. And I know a lot of companies are paying attention to this and are worried, but they're not worried enough. As much as I worry about climate change, if we don't solve this problem, if the US goes down to autocracy, it's going to be really hard to tackle climate change. I mean, we're a huge emitter and a huge factor in any negotiation. And we're going to then be led by people who not only don't care about climate change, they're actually trying to increase the amount of fossil fuels as much as possible. I mean, aside from the reaction to the loss of Russian oil, I mean, there's stuff we have to do right now that's different, but really don't want to move to the clean economy, even though it's healthier, cheaper, better in all dimensions. So what keeps me up at night is, and I'm incredibly worried about is what this country looks like over the next few years. And then from then on, if minority rule takes over, it's very hard to get it back, right? And so I'm worried about the upcoming elections because I actually think it's not just voter suppression, which is not going to help. I think this country is going to elect autocrat, and that's terrifying. And I don't know, I actually don't know how we stop it at this point. So sorry to be a downer, but I think we need more awareness and more action on everybody's part, and just more discussion in business that you can't have a functioning business very well in the kind of country we might become. It's just not good for business.
I mean, I think that's one of the reasons that we look so closely at the link between climate change and equity and justice, because we are seeing that A, it disproportionately impacts communities that are disenfranchised, and B, that we see that, inequality creates challenges to democracy and trust. And we know this, and the research shows that. And so if we can address and tackle both issues at the same time, we're able to make progress in a more meaningful way.
Well, that's the good news about everything being connected. The bad news is like there can be these, dangerous cycles, right? Positive feedback loops, meaning negative things happen, but it's a positive feedback loop because it increases. But when they're all connected, if you're trying to solve one problem, it starts to help the other too, right? The threads are all connected. So I think the solutions also, it's what's so great about going to EVs is because as you then green the grid, you've solved two problems, right? At once. Like I think we're getting better at that kind of systems work.
Definitely. And we had a really interesting discussion earlier with Steve Varley from EY talking about EVs and the green power gap and how we might be able to actually do this on an international level. So that was great. We only have a couple of minutes left. I just want to see if there are other points from the audience. From Lydia, do you think the war in Ukraine will galvanize EU-US climate action to decarbonize, or do you think it will derail climate change actions?
It's a tough look. It's everyone's asking about this. And it's above my pay grade, I guess. But I think right now it's kind of both. There's an immediate need to get more fossil fuels. And I think we'll probably pass something here that gets rid of the gas tax or gives people money back. Encourages. Well, let me come back to this. So I think there's some of it and what's dangerous, as people have pointed out, is we got to bump up. Let's build some more infrastructure so we don't have to rely on Russia. You're then putting infrastructure in place that could last for years and years. That's not a problem if you're actually willing to shut down infrastructure before its asset life is over, which is what a country like China can do. It's the only upside of autocracy. Like they actually can just do it. But in our world, I think if we start building some more infrastructure to just get more natural gas, say, it's going to be hard to keep up with our targets. At the same time, there's clearly an incentive in Europe and elsewhere to get off of the natural gas and get off of Russia's. And I've seen a lot of companies say, there's a lot of countries and regions doing things like they were going to retire a nuclear plant, and they're now not. They're accelerating some of their big renewable projects. So I think we're seeing both. But it's certainly gotten clearer, which we all should have really realized, that fossil fuels are just tied to bad outcomes. Just the petro dictator states are dangerous. And so Europe has to get off fossil fuels. But the only thing I'd say about this that I find just really worrisome and really bothers me is that in previous wars, and I could be, it's who knows, I didn't live in World War II, and maybe we make it sound greater than it was, but people came together and sacrificed. We don't ask anybody to sacrifice anything anymore. Like it started in a way with George Bush and after 9/11 saying, go out and shop. It's part of this narrative, right? That the way we solve things is more stuff, more spending. I can't believe that there's been no push from any real leaders to say, okay, if Russia's X% of Europeans' gas, how do we cut the gas use 15% in the next 3 weeks? Like, what do we do? Everyone turn up the thermostat. Like people say, oh, it's green people telling you to be uncomfortable, but now's a reason, right? Put on the sweater, lower the gas, get your heat pump in. Businesses think hard about the natural gas use. Like, why haven't we been asked to do anything? Because that's frankly a lot better than sending some money to the Red Cross. I mean, because don't you think you could probably cut 10% of something across the economy if you really tried? Because look what happened with the pandemic, right? There were things like that we shifted immediately because it was life and death. So to me, that's part of the answer to both, to keep the movement going, is actually ask people to do something. And that, I think, helps us not have to build more fossil fuel infrastructure.
Great. Some interesting comments in the chat, but just one more question. What are your thoughts on the potential for business collectively to get together and shift the old narrative?
I don't know. I'm not sure if they're as much as, like, I've spent my whole career in this realm trying to make business a leader, a co-leader. I don't think that necessarily means they're best for leading all aspects of this. I'm not sure business has the credibility in a way to set that new narrative. Some do. I mean, that's the whole, if you can kind of act net positive, then you start to show a new narrative. But there's just too many companies who still have a stake in or still believe in the old narrative, right? They just believe it's better. I mean, we saw this in the way Build Back Better went down in the US. What was truly disappointing was not just, we can get mad about Joe Manchin, but he's from West Virginia. Like, he's not going to want to spend as much on climate. Fine. But it was all these companies that have big climate goals, big infrastructure goals, like the auto companies with their EV goals, and then stayed silent and let the US Chamber of Commerce try to kill that bill. And the only reason it had all this spending they needed to hit their climate targets, the only reason was that it rolled back the tax breaks under Trump, tax breaks they didn't need. And so that's what's really disappointing, is that they're still so beholden to the old narrative that they believe it's the fiduciary responsibility to maximize at all costs, that they're actually sacrificing their own ability to thrive in the future. So that's been kind of disappointing. And so I don't know if the narrative can come from business exactly. I think it probably comes from elsewhere. I think it comes from the grassroots. It comes from the Greta Thunbergs of the world. It comes from artists, right? Like, the arts have always been part of the story. The songs, the movies, like Don't Look Up. Like, you start to build a different narrative about the kind of life we want to lead, the amount of consumption we need in our lives. And it's definitely different. Younger generations are using more secondhand stores, trying to live smaller. Not all of them, but like, there's definitely more interest. There's more vegetarianism, or a day of vegetarianism every week. There's more of that as you look younger and younger. So I think it has to come from society. And I don't know how that coalesces, right? I think it's, I don't know how you then make sure that it then gets into the halls of power, because arguably that's kind of the difference between the Tea Party and Occupy. For example, Occupy went and occupied a part of New York for a while and then never got any power. They didn't run anyone. And I think you have to both get ground up, but then actually get into the system. Like, you have to run for something, and you have to get on the school board, become your town rep, become your state rep, and bring those ideas into the halls of power and change them from within.
I think that's a great message to end on, Andrew. Thank you so much. I think definitely for our students, it's a great message. For the faculty members in the room, I think there's a lot of interest on the movement side. So please do keep us posted. Yep. We also know that Paul is the chair of the Global Compact, which runs UN Prime, which we're very involved with. So I think lots of areas of intersection. And so we'll continue to spread the word as things evolve on your end. But just thank you so much for joining. We really appreciate your insights, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks again,
See you
Andrew.
soon. Thanks so much.